All right, so this lesson we're going to start chapter 2 as Jesus goes public with His ministry. First demonstration of His power, and authority. Now, until this time in the book of John, Jesus' ministry is largely practiced among the disciples of John the Baptist. Those are His first disciples. John is pointing to Him. His interaction mostly with the disciples of John, there's a kind of an overlapping period there where John's ministry and Jesus' ministry, they overlap for a certain amount of time. Also, His ministry is confined to His home area and family. And isn't that normal when you become a Christian? Isn't that usually the first place you start to minister? You share with your wife or your brother or something, your cousins, your immediate family, and then you work your way out. Same thing with Jesus. His public ministry begins in His own geographic area, His own family, and then slowly it begins to work its way out. Now there's little, if any, resistance to Jesus at this point. Just as there usually is not too much resistance with our efforts to confess Christ when we first become Christians. I remember when I first became a Christian, boy, I was anxious. I told my mom, and the reaction was, well, that's nice. Good for you. That's kind of what it was like. And we don't usually get a whole lot of resistance if we share our faith with people inside the church building in our own Christian family. And we're not supposed to anyways. It's when we reveal ourselves publicly that the trouble starts, and so it was with Jesus when He starts His public ministry in Cana. So we're at a wedding feast and wedding feasts were great and joyous occasions during that particular time. Life revolved around the religious calendar, around family events. So the first public demonstration of His power begins at a family event, the wedding at Cana. So let's talk a little bit about weddings at this time. A betrothal, today we'd call it an engagement, meant that the couple were legally joined as man and wife, but usually they remained with their own families until cohabitation was arranged. And so there was the idea of the dowry, the dowry had to be fixed, and the family things, the fathers dealt with each other, and that took time. I think I mentioned to you once that in our congregation back in Montreal, we had members of the church who came from Africa, and one brother told me that yes, it took several years, as a matter of fact, to arrange the dowry. There was a lot of bargaining going on between his family and his wife's family to get the right amount. So this was usual in those times as well. The wedding feast signaled that the couple would begin actually living together as husband and wife. There was no ceremony. The apostles didn't serve as ministers for marriage. That's something that came much, much, much later as a tradition. But in Jewish culture, they have a ceremony today, but there was no ceremony then. The betrothal, the arrangement to marry between the families, the contract that was agreed upon, that was pretty much what made you legally married. As a matter of fact, you needed to get a divorce, a legal divorce, to break the betrothal, even if you hadn't lived together. That was the case, wasn't it, with Joseph and Mary, right? They hadn't lived together, obviously. And when Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, what was his first reaction? Well, he was going to divorce her quietly. So that was also part of that culture. A lot of times the groom and his party would parade through the streets in order to fetch his bride. bring her to the wedding feast, from which they would eventually leave to spend their first night together in their home. And we've seen this, and we see this in Europe in small villages. If you've been to Europe, you see that in small villages. There's a parade, a wedding parade going through, and people singing and dancing and playing instruments, and the bride and the groom making their way to where the wedding reception will be. So this was the pattern. The feast itself could be an elaborate event which lasted a week, 7 days or more as guests arrive, and the couple as well. Sometimes we find that difficult to believe. Man, they sat at the table and they ate for 7 days. Think about Thanksgiving. Think about Thanksgiving in large families. Does the celebration only happen when you start cutting the turkey? Well, no. Grandma's coming in on Friday, and then Uncle Joe's coming in from Vermont on Saturday morning, and I think his relatives will show up Sunday, and in the meantime you're cooking for this one and getting that one ready and doing airport runs, and when they say 7 days, by the time the families finally arrived at the wedding feast, it took some time. And then those who had come and had been there a couple of days, they left right after. Those who arrived pretty much on that day stayed a few days longer. So it was a long, they didn't sit at the table for 7 days, but the festival, the happiness, the family reunion, if you wish, would last several days. And of course, this type of celebration required an ample supply of food and drink. Just like, think about Thanksgiving, right? The fridge is packed with stuff. The fridge in the garage is packed with stuff. Same idea, same thing. So it was at such a feast that Jesus was invited along with His disciples at Cana. So we read in verse 1-3, John chapter 2, verses 1-3, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And so Cana was in Galilee, near Jesus' adult home. Jesus, as an adult, he lived somewhere. He lived in the fishing village of Capernaum that we see there, Cana to the east of that. Mary was at the wedding as a friend and as a helper. So we see between the lines that it could have been someone from her family that was being married, because she wasn't just a guest, she was actually a helper. She was helping in the presentation. Again, I come back to my Thanksgiving analogy. Some guests just show up, they sit, they're served, they sit at the table, right? But your mother's sister and her mother, they're the ones who are in the kitchen and getting things organized. So same thing here. Mary is there, she's there as a helper. And the wine ran out early, and in losing the main beverage so soon would spoil the feast, the meal, embarrass the family. So Mary comes to Jesus rather than to the host, and states there's a problem, and in so doing intimates that he should do something. He should do something about it. And it's interesting what his reply is in verse 4 and 5. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says, do it." Now, this term, "Woman, what do I have to do with you? My hour has not come," literally means, never mind. He wasn't being insulting or impolite to his earthly mother. It just meant, don't worry about that. Never mind that. It means, this is my affair, not your affair, your worry. Another translation, what common thing do we share in this? So in her question contains a suggestion that she expects her action to move him to some sort of solution. She's putting pressure on him. And he's replying to her, you don't have to put pressure on me. I know what's happening. This isn't your thing. You don't have to worry about it. And so his answer reveals that he's aware of what is going on and he's in control of the situation. He doesn't act because of her insistence. Jesus said what about the things that he did? Who motivated him to do the things that he did? Yeah, the Father, right? He said, I don't do anything unless the Father tells me to do those things. So it's not because of his mother that he's going to perhaps do something. We find out a little later on that it's a miracle. He doesn't do miracles at the insistence of other people. He doesn't heal people because his apostles come to him and say, you know what, this guy, he's a good guy. I know there are a lot of lepers, but this particular leper, he's one of our buddies. You think you could do something for him? Jesus didn't, that was not his motivation. He says his time is not yet come. God initiates his actions, not man. Note also that the term woman is not a harsh or derogatory term for that time. In John 19:26, what does he say to John? Woman, or to John and Mary, woman, behold your son. Woman, behold your son. All right, here we are in the Gospel of John. Open your Bibles to chapter number 2. That's where we're at this morning. This is lesson number 5, this particular series. All right, in our last lesson we studied the passage that contained Jesus' first miracle, the changing of the water into wine at the wedding in the northern city of Cana. Now after his baptism, Jesus returns to his home area and displays a sign of his miraculous power, but to a very small number of people at the wedding, mainly his family and disciples. And this event is part of the first strand of narrative where John describes Jesus the God-man. So he's going to talk about, remember the overall theme of our study is Jesus the God-man and the various strands of narrative that go through this particular book. One strand being Jesus demonstrating that He is the God-man through His miracles and so on and so forth. Another strand of narrative is people responding to Him with faith and how that happened. And then the third strand of narrative is people responding with disbelief and how that happened. And I've explained to you several times how John kind of interweaves these three narratives together in his gospel. Now in the next section he continues with this strand demonstrating not in a miraculous act, but rather in an act of zeal and authority, Jesus' divine power. So the next scene is described as the cleansing of the temple. So now that Jesus has taken a first step into public ministry at Cana, He's going to go to Jerusalem for a very public and dynamic demonstration, not of a miracle, but of His zeal and His authority. So we go to John chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. It says, the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and He found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers seated at their tables. So even though Jerusalem is south of Galilee, a person was said to go up to Jerusalem, which was the holy, no matter which direction you were, you always went up to Jerusalem. And so Jews from everywhere gathered in Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. Now we know that the temple's center housed the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter on a yearly basis. This building was segregated by a series of walls and courts which separated the priests from the people, the men from the women, and the Jews from the Gentiles. That was the reason for all of these various courts. And so the court of the Gentiles was symbolically the entrance court. It was the first court that you came to when you entered the temple area. And this is where all nations could gather and pray together to the God of all nations. It was the largest of the courts. It was separated from the courts where only the Jews could go, and then these were separated from the places where the priests could go. The porticos, when it talks about Solomon's portico, they were great colonnades. Jesus taught in this area. Many others gathered there for teaching. They didn't have classrooms. Because it became a meeting place for early Christians. The Royal Porch of Herod, which was the south side, where Jesus sat among the doctors of law. This is the area where Jesus was when they found Him when He was 12. Luke chapter 2, verse 46. These are renditions of it, obviously no pictures, but people from the scriptural descriptions have put together models to scale. Very interesting, I saw those when I was there in Jerusalem. The temple area, all of the temple area was considered holy, but it increased in holiness as you approach the center area where the Holy of Holies was situated. So you see there to the left and right of those buildings, that was the court of the Gentiles. And then there was a thing there, a wall, I'll show you in a minute, that allowed men to go in, or women, and then men, and so on and so forth. The gates, various gates. There were 8 entrances into the temple area, each with their own significance. This was the Pilgrim Gate. The Pilgrim Gate led to the court of the Gentiles, as I mentioned, for those visiting. Interesting, the Pilgrim Gates had a large pool of water where pilgrims washed before entering the temple area. The pool, it was called the Pool of Siloam. What was interesting, there was a pilgrim road which led from the Pool of Siloam all the way to the temple area. It was like a road that led from one area to the other, actually all the way to the steps that led to the pilgrim entrance. This is where Peter preached his first sermon, Acts 2:38. I'll go back there. These gates here, these were the Pilgrim Gates. This is where pilgrims would come from all over the world to worship. This is where Peter preached his sermon. Okay? People were baptized. They said, what do they have to do? Go all the way to the river? Well, no. There were pools of water there for the pilgrims to wash before they would go into the holy city. Josephus, the Jewish historian, claims that 1 to 4 million pilgrims each year visited Jerusalem. I'm showing you this, another diagram of the temple to show you the eastern gate. If you notice, it mentions the golden gate right there. That golden gate was also called the eastern gate. It was the main entrance to the temple area. It was the approach through the Mount of Olives and facing the Garden of Gethsemane across the small Kidron Valley. So if you were to go this way, up here was the Garden of Gethsemane. And then you would go down into the Kidron Valley and go back up again and enter into the temple through this golden gate or eastern gate. According to Jewish tradition, the Messiah was supposed to enter through this gate. So we read Zechariah chapter 9, says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, he is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And so that passage is referring to Jesus' triumphal entry. In Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 1 to 3, it says, "Then he brought me back by way of the outer gate of the sanctuary which faces the east." So this is in one of Ezekiel's visions. That gate I'm talking, the eastern gate, right? Watch what he says in his vision now. He says, "And it was shut. The Lord said to me, this gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord God of Israel has entered by it, therefore it shall be shut. As for the prince, he shall sit in it as prince to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by way of the porch of the gate, and shall go out by the same way. And so Ezekiel is talking about this eastern gate, and he's saying the Messiah is going to come through this gate. But then he, in his prophecy, says, but that gate will be shut. Now, that's that gate today. That gate today is shut. It's been cemented up, bricked up. Interestingly, when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 1530 AD, they blocked up this gate with stones, and they planted a cemetery in front of it as their way of preventing the Jewish Messiah from entering in, thinking that no Jew would step on a foreign cemetery because it was unclean. In their mind, the Messiah will never be able to come now because they've blocked the eastern gate that he's supposed to come through, and if he's a Jew, a Jewish Messiah, he'd never step over the grave of a foreign power. Little did they know that the Messiah had already come. But anyways, little brickwork that was too late in coming. So this part of Jerusalem is still controlled by Muslims. The gate is still blocked, the cemetery is still there, and a mosque stands where the Holy of Holies, I'll show you that later, where the Holy of Holies used to be. So where the Holy of Holies used to be, now there's a mosque that stands exactly on that spot. All right, so back to historical temple. This is Herod's temple, by the way, not Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was destroyed and then rebuilt again in the time of Herod. So there were the courts. This was the woman's court in the foreground, you see there before the steps. Women could not mix with men in the temple area and had their own area, but they could go no further in. It was in this court that the court treasury was, 12 trumpet-shaped containers for voluntary offerings. Jesus was sitting opposite the treasury when he saw the widow put in the 2 coins, or only 2 coins. She was in the court of women. The court of Israel was a smaller place. Once you left the court of women, you walked up the steps there, and that was the court of Israel. This was the place where Jewish men gathered who were neither priests nor Levites. This is where the Jewish laymen gathered for prayer and so on and so forth. The court of the priests, I've got different models I'm showing you. The court of the priests is not in the foreground, that's the court of the women. Go 1 step through those golden doors there, you had the court of the priests. Only priests could enter here.